They said I was unfit, that I was slow. I was 7. I didn't understand the words, just the way the nurse held me down. Anonymous letter. 1931. Hidden behind tall fences and sterile walls stood buildings that claimed to be schools, but they weren't. Not really. They were institutions. Dressed in the language of education, cloaked in the false promise of care, places where thousands of children were locked away, not for crimes they committed, but for who they were born to be. In the early 1900s, America began a quiet war, not on other nations, but on its own people, on its children, those deemed feeble-minded, morally defective, or simply too poor to be worth saving. And so began the era of eugenics boarding schools talked here. Classrooms had no lessons, beds were lined like prison cells, and silence wasn't just expected, it was enforced. Boys were sterilized without consent. Girls disappeared after medical treatments. These were not forgotten mistakes, they were deliberate designs, part of a grand experiment in social engineering. This is not just a story about what happened behind locked doors, it's a story of lives that were erased by a nation that called itself free. This is the story of the schools that broke children, and the system that built them. In the early years of the 20th century, a quiet war was declared. Not with bullets, not with banners, but with clipboards, IQ tests, and sterilization records. It began with a theory, a dangerous idea, wrapped in the language of science, dripping with moral superiority, eugenics. The belief that society could be improved by controlling who was allowed to reproduce, that intelligence, morality, even poverty, were inherited traits, and that those deemed unfit were a threat to the nation's future. This wasn't fringe thinking, it wasn't hidden in the shadows, it was taught in universities, echoed by politicians, and funded by some of the wealthiest names in America. Presidents praised it, judges upheld it, and doctors followed. Orders in their eyes, the unfit weren't just a burden, they were a disease to be removed, and so the machinery was built. Across the country, institutions began to appear, often with names like State School for the mentally defective or Home for the feeble-minded. But just as often, they wore masks, reform schools, industrial academies, training homes, places where wayward youth were sent to be corrected, where poor children, immigrants, or those with disabilities were placed under state controls, sometimes for life. There was no due process, no defense. All it took was a social worker's suspicion, a teacher's report, or a family too poor to fight back. Some were orphans, some were simply unwanted. Many had no idea what they had done wrong. Once inside, they weren't students. They were wards and the curriculum. Obedience, labor, and silence. These schools weren't built to educate. They were built to eliminate. Not through violence in the streets, but through policies passed in courtrooms, through sterilization performed under anesthesia, through records erased, and names changed. This was the beginning of America's eugenics empire for thousands of children. It began with a letter, a knock at the door, and a one-way trip to a school with no future. They looked like school-said brick buildings, dormitories with barred windows, neatly trimmed lawns, and tall iron gates. But these weren't places of learning. They were holding cells for children society wanted to forget. Across the American landscape, rural towns, remote valleys, and the outskirts of cities, these institutions had names that implied care. State Training School, Industrial Academy, School for the Feeble-Minded. They promised discipline, structure, and moral rehabilitation, but behind closed doors. There were factories of silence. Each building was part of a machine designed to isolate, contain, and erase. Children were assigned numbers, their identities stripped away. They lived under strict regimens, up at dawn. Labor during the day, silence at meals. Many were forced to clean, farm, sew, or manufacture goods for the state. It was education in name only. What they learned was submission. These weren't troubled youth. Not all of them. Many had done nothing more than stutter, behave differently, or be born poor. Some were orphans, some were committed by their own families, out of shame, desperation, or pressure from the state, and once inside, escape was almost impossible. Architecture served a purpose. Windowless rooms. Long hallways with echoing footsteps, locks on the outside of doors, isolation. Cells for discipline. Even fresh air was rationed. Yard time was a privilege, not a right, but perhaps the most chilling part. What happened beneath the surface? Because these institutions didn't just house children, they changed them. By the 1920s, over half the US states had passed compulsory sterilization laws. Under these laws, if a child was deemed mentally deficient, immoral, or unfit for reproduction, the state could authorize their sterilization without consent, without a trial, without informing the child or their family. Doctors called it preventative. Medicine, bureaucrats called it public good. But for those children, it was a betrayal cloaked in science. They were brought to cold rooms, told they were having an appendix removed, or a routine checkup. They woke up empty, their futures decided by forms, their bodies altered by strangers, and no one came to stop it. These weren't crimes hidden in the shadows. They were legal, documented, and funded, and across decades. Tens of thousands of children would pass through these gates. Some would leave broker, others would never leave at all. The buildings still stand today. Some are abandoned, some have been repurposed, but walk through them carefully. And you might still hear the echoes of lives changed forever by a lie dressed up as science. Inside the walls, time stopped, and so did childhood from the outside. These buildings stood still, weather-worn bricks, peeling paint, barred windows. But inside, a quiet war was waged every day, not with weapons, but with discipline, needles, and fear. Children woke to the sound of metal whistles and barked commands. Beds had to be made with military precision, shoes polished, floors scrubbed. Pasture straight. A wrinkle in your blanket could mean a slap across the face. Breakfast was eaten in silent stalking. Even whispering was punished. Some were denied food for misbehavior, others were made to eat in isolation. Staring at a white wall while guards watched from the shadows. Then came labor hours spent in workshops, fields, or laundry rooms, sewing uniforms. Cleaning latrines, fixing broken tools. Work wasn't a lesson, it was a sentence, and there was no end to it. One girl, committed at age 10, recalled. They told me I was slow. I didn't know what that meant, but every day I scrubbed floors till my hands bled when I cried. They called me defective. Children were grouped by functionality. Those deemed most effective were sent to locked wards. Sedated, forgotten disobedience was met with punishments. Solitary confinement in dark rooms for days, ice baths, cold enough to burn, electroshock therapy, isolation cells with nothing but a metal cot and a bucket. They called them treatments, but they left scars that never healed. Boys were beaten with belts and wooden paddles. Girls were often subjected to even worse, stripped of dignity, and sometimes their voices forever. Medical records show forced drugging, powerful sedatives to keep children's azole injections, with unknown substances, labeled only by numbers, no consent, no explanations, just obedience, and the worst part? These horrors were documented in tidy, clinical handwriting. Patient responded poorly to instruction. Suggested treatment, extended confinement, sterilization recommended due to moral degeneracy. Some children tried to ruin her. Few even made it past the fences, but many were dragged back, and those who resisted were made an example of. The goal was never education, it was erasure to grind away the personality, the will, the identity, and, if only obedient shells remained. Some children forgot their names, others forgot how to speak, and many never forgot the sound of keys turning behind them, because inside those walls, the real lesson was simple. You do not matter, not to them, not to the system, not even to history. They were not numbers, not defectives, not cases. They were children with names, with dreams, with stories that were buried deeper than their graves. One of them was Annie. Mitchell committed at age 7 for being unruly in school. Her only diagnosis? Too curious, too outspoken her. Records list her as non-compliant. She died 2 years later during an unspecified treatment. No one came to claim her body. Her grave? Marked only with the number 287A rusted metal tag beneath overgrown weeds. Then there was Daniel Cooper, a biracial boy from Ohio. He was sent to an institution after his parents were told he had uncontrollable fits. Later, it was suspected he had epilepsy, a condition misunderstood, feared. In the margins of his file, a staff member scrawled, "He cries for his mother at night." Often punished, he was sterilized at age 14. Some children survived long enough to speak to tell their stories decades later, voices trembling as they remembered being locked in rooms, their cries echoing into silence. Mary Rose, now in her 80s, still remembers the sound of the leather strap. She said, "They told me I was sick, but the sickness wasn't in me. It was in them." Her only crime? Being born to a single mother in a world that deemed poverty hereditary, and then there were no stories at all, just files, just fragments. A pair of shoes in a storage box, a letter that never reached its sender, a drawing of a son with no face many families were told their children had. Died, some were told they'd been transferred, in truth. Many simply vanished, absorbed into a system that erased them on purpose. Photographs fade, but pain does not today. Graveyards behind old institutions still whisper, small. Forgotten headstones line the woods. Some bear initials, others bear nothing at all. In one cemetery, researchers uncovered over 1,200 unmarked graves. No records, no names, just silence. And yet, some memories refuse to die. Letter tucked in a Bible photo passed down generations, a sibling who never stopped searching. These weren't institutions of care. They were machines of disappearance, of rewriting bloodlines, of fixing a future by silencing the present and the children. They became ghosts, not from death, but from deliberate forgetting. Behind every broken child was a machine, polished, funded, respected. Didn't operate in basements or secret labs. It ran in the opened with papers published, grants awarded, names carved in stone in the early 20th century. The American eugenics movement wasn't fringe science, it was mainstream policy. Harvard, Yale, Stanford. These weren't bystanders. They were architects, professors, with white coats and tenured seats, declared war not on disease, but on difference. They published charts claiming to prove that poverty, mental illness, criminality, and even immorality were inherited traits, and thus began the search. For the unfit, the Carnegie Institution funded massive research to map out defective bloodlines. Their Eugenics Record Office, founded in 1910, collected tens of thousands of family trees. Searching for patterns they thought needed to be cut out, one of their reports proposed this: society must prevent the propagation of defectives. That meant sterilization, institutionalization. Shea state governments took the hint by 1935. 32 U.S. states had laws allowing forced sterilization, many directly modeled on research from American universities. Virginia's 1924 sterilization law even became the basis for the infamous Supreme Court case Buck v. Bell. Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. ruled, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. That one sentence gave the green light to tens of thousands of forced sterilizations. Medical boards followed suit. Doctors were told they were purifying society. Surgeries were done without concentric halls. Altered children categorized as subhuman because a powerful network needed them to be, and the federal government? It looked away, or worse, paid for it. Taxpayer money funded these institutions, funded the research, funded the silence, and the echo of America's machine would not stop at its shores. Germany in the 1930s studied American eugenics. Nazi scientists cited U.S. sterilization laws to build their owning 1934. A Nazi official wrote, The United States has shown us the path. That path led to death camps, but it started in classrooms, clinics, and courts where respected men in suits debated whose life was worth living. This wasn't just a failed idea. It was a system backed by science, law, medicine, media, and education, a machine with gears that turned quietly until it crushed real people underneath, and by the time the world called it evil America, had already erased thousands. When the doors of those institutions finally creaked open, wasn't because justice broke them down, it was because time did. The buildings aged, funding dried up, and society moved on, but justice, it never really came. Some survivors walked out with nothing but their names scratched into old walls. Others never walked out at all there. Stories were buried beneath sealed files, bureaucratic stone walls, and societal shame. Many states destroyed records. Others locked them behind confidentiality laws, making it nearly impossible for families to trace what happened, or to whom the lawsuits came slowly, too slowly, in the 1990s and early 2000s. Some survivors began to speak. They were in their 70s, 80s, 90s, trying to make sense of childhood's loss. Some shared testimonies of surgeries they didn't understand, paperwork they never signed, labels they never deserved, but most faced what they always had: silence. A few states issued formal apologies: North Carolina, Virginia, California. But an apology without action is just a whisper compensation. Programs were proposed, then cut, then quietly forgotten. Only a handful of victims received even symbolic restitution. Most got nothing. And the schools? Some became condos, others were razed, their history paved over both literally and in the classroom. Why isn't this taught? Why doesn't every American student know what was done in the name of science, progress, and purity? Why are the words eugenics and sterilization absent from the textbooks? Why are the survivors still waiting to be heard? The truth is uncomfortable. It unravels the idea that evil always looks like a villain sometimes. It looks like a teacher, a doctor, a judge, a principal elite, wears a tie, it uses big words, it smiles as it signs the order. For the survivors still with us, they don't need another apology. They need recognition, restoration, a name in the book, place in the archive, because what was taken from them wasn't just their childhood, it was the right to exist without shame, and until we confront it, we risk repeating it, because history doesn't just live in the past, it waits in the silence. Somewhere in America, a school still stands, not in name but in memory, buried under weeds, shadows, and silence. Its walls no longer hold children, but echoes, their voices, once ignored, now rattle through broken windows and rusted bed springs. If you listen closely, you can still hear them whisper, "I was here." Not every scar leaves a mark you can see. Some are inherited, some are denied, some are rewritten until they disappear. But history has a way of breathing beneath the floorboards. And this story, this truth, refuses to stay buried. The children who lived through this didn't vanish. They were erased by ink, by policy, by choice, and yet we remember them now not as victims, but as proof of what happens when a society decides who gets to be remembered and who deserves to be forgotten. So ask yourself, how many more ruins must we uncover before we start asking, who did we choose to forget?